Alright, so I wanted to do a video about one of the new features that AWS released recently. Now this is called resource control policies. This is a new feature in enforcing IAM policies to resources, just what it sounds like. But there is a tendency for this feature to be a little bit confusing than existing ones, and if you just go ahead and enable resource control policies on your existing organization, there's a chance that you might end up breaking stuff that you didn't intend to. So I thought of doing a video to explain what it does and just go through one of the demonstration and maybe discuss some of the best practices that might be helpful if you intend to use this feature in your AWS organization. So the blog post that AWS did for this release goes into the new feature, pretty much into all the details. But if you're a newcomer to AWS, or if you're not that familiar with the existing features in AWS that works somewhat similar to this new feature, you might not understand what the differentiating factor of this release is. So let's consider an AWS account, basically a single account that can be considered as a permission domain. So in that domain, there are multiple things involved when it comes to determining if you can perform certain actions on certain resources under certain conditions. The obvious first candidate in that list of things is permission policies. You probably already know about permission policies. You grant permission policies to a user or a group or even to a role to provide permissions so that these principals can take certain actions. So when I say principal in AWS, a principal is a user, a human user, or a system user such as a service, or it could be a role that you assume into. So a service or a human user could assume a role and perform certain tasks based on the permissions that are granted to that role. So you have these principals, and then you have the actions those principals can perform. And then you have resources those actions can be performed on, and you have other things like the conditions under which certain actions can be performed on certain resources. There are two kinds of permission policies. The first is called identity policies. These are the permission policies that you grant to the principals. And then there's another kind of policies called resource policies, which are used to grant permissions on resources so that certain principals can interact with those resources. Now all principal types support identity policies, but only a subset of resource types support resource policies. If you have somewhat of an experience in AWS, you might have already come across resource policies. Now if you ever enabled S3 bucket policies and worked with them, that's a kind of a resource policy. And also you have other resource policies such as KMS key policies, SQS queue policies. All of these are resource policies that are part of the puzzle when it comes to managing permissions of principals and the resources that they can act on. Now so far what we have done is to grant permissions to either identities or resources, but then there's the need to enforce policies on how much of permissions can be granted to both of these parties. Now before this recent release was done, there was already a way to enforce policies on identity policies called service control policies. Now service control policies, or SCPs, are a way to enforce a maximum limit of permissions that can be granted to any kind of principal. So you could say any policy that is granted to an IAM user should not have permission to create new users, for example. Now with that service control policy applied, you can still have an identity policy granting the permission to create IAM users, but at the end of the day, when an IAM user tries to use that permission, that gets denied because the service control policy at the top of the hierarchy denies that operation. So service control policies are a way to limit what you can do. They don't grant you permissions. So to grant permissions, you have to use permission policies. So far, service control policies are used to limit the level of access for the principal. So it's a principal-centric way of looking at the permission model. But this new release, resource control policies, is a way to apply the same kind of enforcement but for resource policies. So we talked about identity policies and resource policies. For identity policies, you have service control policies to enforce policies, and for resource policies, you have resource control policies. So that's why they sound the same, they behave in the same way, but they are different ways of looking at the same permission model. Now, just like service control policies, resource control policies can be applied to different levels of the hierarchy in an AWS organization. Now, an AWS organization is basically a hierarchy of organization units and accounts, and you can assign a resource control policy to the root of the organization. So that means that resource control policy is applicable to all the accounts. So whenever someone tries to access a resource that has an applicable resource control policy at the top of the hierarchy, that gets evaluated in the policy evaluation process. But having said that, yes, you can apply the resource control policy to the entire organization, but since this is a new dimension of working with identity policies, it is recommended that you start testing your resource control policies at a restricted scope, so probably a sandbox account, and see what kind of impact that has, and then start bringing that resource control policy up the hierarchy, so you could start applying it for a certain organization unit, and if it is applicable after a lot of testing, you can apply that to the entire organization. RCPs and SCPs might be a little bit confusing because sometimes they seem to be addressing the same space in this problem, and yes, in some cases you can use both SCPs and RCPs to apply the same kind of guardrail, let's say in control tower, but just keep in mind that SCPs are for principals and RCPs are for resource policies. So one of the examples in this blog post that AWS created for this release is about not allowing anyone outside the organization to access S3 buckets. So that RCP itself does not grant any permissions. What it does is to set a maximum limit for the principals that can access S3 buckets. So with this policy applied, you can still give full control of sub accounts or sub organization units to different parts of the business, for example, and then not be worried that they'll be opening up S3 buckets and maybe going against organization policy about data access. So one of the key points that AWS uses to promote this new feature is being able to create what's called a data perimeter. So you're basically enforcing what kind of limit of access should be there for all the organization. You're not exactly enforcing permission policies on individual resources, you're just setting the boundaries, and then you can let the rest of your organization work with different resources as they please without having to worry about breaking policy or without having to, for example, consult you in everyday business. Also, for newcomers, I think there's some confusion about why features like service control policies and this new feature resource control policies are needed when they don't exactly grant permissions. Now, one of the questions you might have is why go to trouble with all these control policies when you can just not give permissions to users. Now, that is true. The first step to limit permissions given to a principal is to not give them permissions. But in real life, the people that manage the information security standards, organization policies, or even managing the overall cloud strategy and the approach to cloud security are different people than the people that actually implement these policies. These could be cloud architects, information security executives, or just outside consultants that come in and set up best practices for the organization to keep on working on AWS. Now, the people that are subjected to these policies and that should work under these policies are a different type of a job role. So they are mostly either DevOps engineers or even IT support whenever they onboard new users or onboard new projects. So there's a clear distinction between these two roles, and that's why SCPs and RCPs are needed. So you can set up that boundary while allowing people like DevOps engineers and IT support to keep on working without effectively blocking their day-to-day work. Now, with that in mind, let me do a brief demonstration on how resource control policies work. Now, there is an example in this blog post about not allowing outside users to access S3 buckets, but I came up with my own example just to go off the beaten path because yes, most of the time these examples would work, but I wanted to see what kind of other areas are involved in this new release. Alright, so for this demo, I have two accounts, workload A and backup. One starts with 7.6 and the other one with 8.9. And in the workload account, I have a KMS key with a key policy that allows users from both of these accounts to describe the key. So if I use the access keys from the other account and try to describe the key, I should be able to get an output. Just going to copy the key ARN. Right, there it is. We have the key description in JSON. I did this by using the credentials from the other account, the backup account. Now I'm going to apply an RCP that basically says I can't do that. I have to get credentials from the same account to describe the key. So the first step I should do here is to enable resource control policies. Now if you go into AWS organization and go into policies, scroll down, you'll see this new item called resource control policies. Now I've already enabled this. If you see disabled here, just go here and you'll see a big button that says enable resource control policies. Pretty straightforward stuff. So after you enable resource control policies, you can create new policies. So if you just go to create policy, there's a visual editor that you can use to create new statements. And with that, I have created a new resource control policy that says do not allow users outside of workload account to describe keys. Now this is basically a deny statement, so just keep in mind that if you use allow statements here, that doesn't mean you're granting permission. You're allowing those permissions to be granted. So here I'm saying deny describe key action to any principal if they are not from the same account or if they are not an AWS service. So here this condition basically says if an AWS service tries to execute this action of describe key, then allow it, because I need other services to be able to describe that specific key. But any human users that would try to do this, they will have to use credentials from this account, which is the workload A account. So this is basically the policy, and I'm going to go back to the policies and attach it to the workload account and attach policy. So this policy is now attached. So if I go back to the terminal with the credentials that I have from the other account and try to execute the same call, I should get an access denied error, because this operation, describe operation, is now denied even though the KMS key policy still grants me that action. So just keep in mind, with an RCP in effect, you can still save a resource policy that grants that permission, but it gets evaluated at the policy evaluation logic. So even though this policy says that this is granted, because an RCP that denies it is in effect, in AWS policy evaluation logic, the deny takes precedence, so I can't perform that operation even though I'm coming from this account. So let me just go back and remove the RCP, and then we'll execute the same API call again. So this time I'm going to go to the accounts, select the account, and if I go down to policies, there's a new section called resource control policies. Then I can detach this attached policy. It gives me a warning. Okay, there's consequences. That's fine. So I've detached the service control policy. So if I go back and in the same session, if I execute the call,
1 minute later.
Alright, so I tried to execute the same call just after removing the resource control policy, but it looks like there's a certain delay in that RCP removal being actually effective in the policy evaluation logics. It took about 10-15 seconds for my request to actually go through. Until that, I got this same error that says there's an explicit deny in a resource control policy. So if you've already worked with SCPs, service control policies, this is the same kind of error that you get, except it says a service control policy. So before I end the video, I want to go and show some more details about this new feature. Now I demonstrated how to enable resource control policies. One thing I missed there was this default policy that gets attached to every resource, basically the root of the organization, called RCP full AWS access. Now this is an AWS managed RCP, and you can't modify that, you can't remove it from the organization, and this allows you to keep on working with RCPs without breaking existing function. So this policy is basically allowing everything to be done, so there are no additional explicit denies being added just by enabling RCPs, and then you can start adding specific deny RCPs to different levels of your organizational hierarchy. So I hope this was a useful breakdown of the new feature by AWS. I'm personally excited to see how this can be used for different scenarios when it comes to setting up a good landing zone. So I'm hoping to see more strongly recommended guardrails, for example in Control Tower, to pop up based on RCPs in the future. There'll be new developments in this area. So if you're interested, keep a lookout for that. And if this video was helpful to you in any way, please don't forget to like the video. Also subscribe if you haven't. I'll be making more videos like this in the future. But having said that, that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week.